What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my Week 3 quarterback start sits. So going through every single Week 3 matchup and listing every starting quarterback as either a start, fringe option, or a sit. The starts are the players you feel very confident throwing into your lineup. The fringe options, these are going to be like your back-end QB1s, your high-end QB2s. They're solid in there, but you probably don't love them. And then your sits, these are players who ideally would either be on the waiver wire or just sitting on your bench. If you guys have any fantasy questions, drop them down below. If you're just going to ask a start-sit question, just give me the scoring setting. Helps me give you guys the best answer. If I do help you out, just do me a huge favor and hit that like button. But let's jump into the first matchup of the week, Thursday Night Football. Giants taking on the 49ers. And for the Giants, Daniel Jones looked really rough in week 1. I was very high on him heading into the season. I did think he was going to have a bounce back against the Cardinals. It looked rough early on, but second half, they really kind of put it together. This is a really tough matchup here against the 49ers, but I still think he's a fringe option as like a fringe QB1. He has some rushing upside, which can kind of save him from bad matchups. So I do think he's like probably a high-end QB2 this week. If you have him, I don't think he's the worst start in the world, but this matchup does make it kind of tough. On the other side with the 49ers, I think Brock Purdy is just pretty consistently going to be in this fringe area. He's surrounded by stacked weapons, so I think he's probably also right in that same range with Daniel Jones. Moving over to the Sunday slate, we have the Colts taking on the Ravens. We saw Anthony Richardson leave early on in the Week 2 game with a concussion. He had 2 rushing touchdowns really early on. Looked like he was going to put together a massive fantasy day, and then unfortunately he had to leave. If he suits up in this game, I think he's a locked-in start. I've honestly seen enough out of him through 2 weeks where I feel like he's a pretty consistent start in your lineup no matter what. Even in bad matchups, he has that rushing upside to kind of save him. If Anthony Richardson is not able to play this week and Gardner Minshew's the starter, I'd have him as a sit. Kind of a tough matchup here against the Ravens, so I'd really only want the starting quarterback if it was Anthony Richardson. For the Ravens, Lamar Jackson, I think he looked really strong as a passer in week 2. He's a locked-in start every single week. Moving over to the Titans-Browns matchup, Ryan Tannehill had a solid bounce back in week 2. Nothing crazy fantasy-wise, but week 1 was just really rough overall. I still think he's a sit here. The Browns' defense has been tough, and I mean Tannehill was never all that exciting of a fantasy option anyway. On the other side for the Browns, this ideally should be a solid matchup here for Deshaun Watson. I just think what we've seen out of him through 2 weeks has not been great. He's probably still like a back-end QB1 this week, but I think week 1 I could kind of give him a pass in terms of his passing because the weather was bad. We also saw Joe Burrow really struggle. Week 2 was not a great look against the Steelers, so he's going to be a fringe option for me. Maybe he starts to come around throughout the season, but you kind of would have expected or at least hoped that he would have started off the 2023 season like where he left off pre-suspension and pre-sitting out the season. Moving over to the Falcons Lions matchup, definitely going to be sitting Desmond Ridder. There's really just like no locked-in floor of what the passing volume is going to be like, so definitely not interested in playing Desmond Ridder. For the Lions, I think Jared Goff is a nice fringe option. He's probably someone who's just going to slot in here pretty consistently. Doesn't have the craziest weapons, but can give you a solid, high-end QB2 production. Moving over to the Saints-Packers matchup, I'm going to have Derek Carr as a sit. Did not look great in week 2, even though he's surrounded by strong weapons with Olave, Michael Thomas, Rashid Shaheed. He's just not someone I really want to be relying on for my fantasy production. For the Packers, Jordan Love has looked really strong through 2 weeks. Back-to-back games with 3 passing touchdowns. We'll see if he gets Christian Watson back here in week 3. The Saints defense has been pretty tough to opposing quarterbacks to start off the season. They made Ryan Tannehill look really rough, and then Bryce Young really couldn't get anything moving in week 2. Now, obviously, those aren't 2 like elite high-end quarterbacks. Bryce Young, rookie season. Tannehill, just not an elite option. So it is possible Jordan Love finds success here. I would just prefer to go after some other quarterbacks here this week in week 3. In the next game, we're going to have the Texans taking on the Jaguars, and CJ Stroud has been very impressive through 2 weeks. They've kind of put a lot on his shoulders in terms of passing volume, and he's come through with 2 pretty impressive performances. I'm going to have him as a sit here. I just think he can put together some strong games, but there are going to be some growing pains here. I just feel like in a 1 quarterback league, 10, 12 teamer, if you have to play CJ Stroud, I just think the quarterback position probably isn't in a great spot on your offense. On the other side with the Jaguars, Trevor Lawrence coming off of a down game. I still think he's a locked-in start. Very strong weekly mid QB1 option. Then we're going to have the Broncos taking on the Dolphins. For the Broncos, Russ had a pretty solid fantasy day, just not someone I really want to be relying on pretty consistently. He had the Hail Mary later on. It still doesn't look like he's back to his Seattle form. I kind of feel like this is what we're going to be getting at this point. So not someone I want in my fantasy lineup. For the Dolphins here, definitely going to be starting Tua. Didn't go as crazy as he did in week 1, but that pretty much would have been impossible. The Dolphins offense looks really strong to start off the season, and I think he's a nice fantasy play this week. Then we're going to have the Chargers taking on the Vikings. I think this game should be pretty fun. Probably going to be a shootout. I think both these passers are going to have a lot of success. Herbert's been solid through 2 weeks. Kirk Cousins coming off of a big fantasy day. I like both of these dudes lined up as starts here. And then we're going to have a divisional matchup between the Patriots and the Jets. Going to be sitting both of these players. I think Mac Jones has looked solid through 2 weeks. He really just doesn't have the strong weapons around him to carry him. Also a tougher matchup here against the Jets. And then Zach Wilson, I mean, don't really need an explanation there. He's a locked-in sit. Then we're going to have the Bills taking on the Commanders. For the Bills, you continue to fire up Josh Allen as a high-end QB1. He struggled in week 1, came back with a really nice week 2 performance. For the Commanders, Sam Howell coming off of a pretty impressive day. This is just going to be a tough matchup here against the Bills, so someone I'd be avoiding for fantasy this week. Then we are going to have the Panthers taking on the Seahawks. For the Panthers, I'm going to be sitting Bryce Young. This is going to be the year for Bryce Young to just, kind of settle into the NFL. He's not surrounded by strong weapons, so I'm not really expecting a ton out of him in terms of fantasy production. He's definitely going to be a sit. Even going up against the Seahawks, which is probably a pretty favorable matchup, still wouldn't really want to trust him in my lineup. For the Seahawks here, I went back and forth, honestly, between Geno being a fringe option or start. I think he's right there, probably like back-end QB1 territory. I ended up settling on a fringe option. The Panthers have been pretty tough against quarterbacks to start off the season, but I mean, they've also gone up against Desmond Ridder and Derek Carr, so it's not exactly like they've been shutting down world beaters at the quarterback position. I think Geno's a solid play. Had a rough week 1, bounced back in week 2, so I have him as a fringe option, but pretty top-tier fringe option, I'd say. And then we're going to have the Cowboys taking on the Cardinals. For the Cowboys here, I like Dak Prescott as a start. The Cardinals defense kind of showed up in week 1. Week 2, we saw Daniel Jones put together a really nice fantasy day. Pretty sure also Budda Baker just got put on IR, so that's a big hit to their secondary. So I do like Dak Prescott as a start. Hopefully he gets Brandon Cooks back to be his locked-in wide receiver 2. In the next matchup, we're going to have the Bears taking on the Chiefs. And even though Justin Fields hasn't been a great fantasy option through 2 weeks, I'm still going to go back to the well and start him. Week 1, we saw some decent rushing production out of him. Week 2, it was just completely non-existent. Even though he hasn't looked great as a passer, I think we need to remember that, there was long stretches of last season where he wasn't great as a passer, and he was still able to deliver with his legs. I still think you can trust him in your lineup. He has that very high ceiling, and it just feels like the time you go to bench Justin Fields is the game where he's going to rip off like a 70-yard touchdown run, and he's going to have a massive day. So I'm still rolling with Justin Fields for fantasy. I think like long-term as like a dynasty asset, you should probably be pretty concerned about Justin Fields at this point. But as like a weekly, season-long option, I still think he's a decent start. And then for the Chiefs, you obviously fire up Patrick Mahomes every single week. We're going to have the Steelers taking on the Raiders. 2 pretty clear sits here. Kenny Pickett's looked rough through 2 weeks. Steelers offense as a whole has been pretty bad. And then for Jimmy G, definitely just someone I don't want to be relying on for fantasy. We're going to have the Eagles taking on the Buccaneers. Jalen Hurts, you fire him up as a high-end QB1 every single week. For the Bucs, Baker Mayfield has looked decent through 2 weeks, but I do think this will be a very interesting test for this Bucs offense as a whole. They had 2 pretty soft matchups the first 2 weeks of the season, Vikings and Bears. We'll see how they do against a more respected defense. So he's going to be a sit this week. We'll see what happens on Monday Night Football. And then the final game of the week, that second Monday night game, Rams taking on the Bengals. I have both of these quarterbacks listed as fringe options. Matthew Stafford has looked pretty impressive to start off the season. He hasn't necessarily translated it to great fantasy production, but it's just because the passing touchdowns haven't been there, the volume's been there, and the touchdowns have kind of gone to the running backs or just other spots. So he's going to be a fringe option for me. For the Bengals, I also have dropped Joe Burrow to a fringe option. We don't even know if he's going to play in this game. But it doesn't seem like he's going to be 100% healthy even if he does play. He's looked really rough through 2 weeks, so I'm going to have him as a fringe option. I still think he's probably like a back-end QB1, high-end QB2 if he does suit up, but definitely not like the locked-in, set it and forget it like he's been in previous weeks or even dating back to last season. But that's going to wrap it up for every single week 3 matchup. If you guys are interested in my tight end start sit video, that's going to be up today also. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. Any questions, drop them down below. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.